Hello, I'm Sam Taylor. I'm an author. I'm talking today at Texarkana A&M University to Tom Wright, author of What Dies in Summer. And we were just talking before about hot and cold work, about the subconscious element of writing and the more critical element of rewriting that comes after it. Certainly my own feeling is that when I'm doing hot work, it's something that exhausts me much more than the cold work does. It's also more enjoyable. It's also something that feels, it's a kind of euphoric feeling when it goes well. Do you have the same feeling about the two?
Euphoric, that's a very good word for it. It's almost rapturous at times. And again, I think there's a direct correlation between how rapturous it does feel and how good the final product turns out to be. We all, I mean, we're supposed to all have a good work ethic. We work when it's time to work and so on, but that doesn't work very well for artists. When you're trying to create art, when you're trying to be creative, it is a matter of tapping into that level of yourself, and it is a matter of kind of watching it happen more, to me, as I experience it, than it is to just feel that you're jumping in and that you're manhandling the material into shape. When I try to do that, it doesn't work as well. It doesn't turn out as good. And I think the cold work, as you described it, I think that's where the rational element does come in. And I think you have to be good at that too. I think if you're not good at that, what you have is going to be kind of jumbled. It's going to seem poorly stitched together and so on. It's you kind of almost have to. It's like a quilt, you kind of have to create the swatches with the color, the patterns, and so on. And when you have done that and you have a quilt's worth of those, then you go into that phase of stitching it carefully, stitching them together and so on. I really think that, to me, that's how I would think of the cold work aspect of it. It may not be how you do it.
I think all writers are very different in terms of how they go about writing. I mean, one thing that is probably a big difference between is that for 10 years I did it as my only job, and I was just writing. And I assume because you had the psychology practice that you weren't able to, or maybe didn't even want to do that. So how did it fit into your life generally?
Well, actually it didn't for decades. When I started out as an undergraduate, I did want to write. I definitely did, but this was also the stage of my life where I got married the first time and had to start thinking about, well, what can I make enough money at to feed a family and so on, make a living. And I did not feel that writing was, I didn't have any thought that I could make a living at it. I didn't feel that it was a steady enough income that I could make it work and so on. So I made the choice to step away from it. But in a way I didn't either, because the university where I was at the time had a great creative writers workshop, and so I signed up for that every semester. Now while I was there, for the rest of my tenure there as an undergraduate, I was writing, and that is a great venue to learn in, creative writers workshop, where you have other writers that have no hesitation to slash you to ribbons. They really are critical, but it's useful criticism. It's very perceptive criticism. But fast forward to graduate school and then a career in psychology and so on, it was a matter of having just left it over here somewhere, left it behind. And still, I don't know what it would feel like to be a full-time writer, because I have a day job. It was a long, hard trek to get the first novel written. It grew from a seed, a short story that was kind of a fictionalized version of something that actually did happen to me and my cousin. And I showed it to my wife, and she read it, and she said, "Well, you're not through now." And I think, "What do you mean?" She said, "I've got to know where where it goes from here. I've got to know what happens to these characters. And that caused me then to look at the prospect of just starting to stack up pages and go on from there and see what I could do about making it more of a story. And it kind of flowed naturally. It felt right, and I stayed with it until it was actually a novel. And I'm given to understand that's not how everyone approaches it, because some people seem to feel that they have to have the framework in mind. They have to have the overall shape of the novel in mind before they start. I didn't do this one that way. And again, you mentioned earlier, everyone who approaches it, everyone who tries to write probably does it in a different way. That my way, that may be something that, as it turned out, that's how I did it. It worked. Therefore, I may be locked into that now, just by that feeling of success. It's really hard to say, though. It's when you're talking about what you do. It's kind of similar to riding around in a car that you never get out of. You're locked into it. You can never be outside of that car. You know a lot about what the dashboard looks like and the seats and everything, but you don't know what your tires look like. You don't know what the undercarriage of the car looks like. Well, it's a little like that when you're looking from the inside out. You almost have to depend on someone else to tell you what kind of a writer you are. And so that may also be another thing that other people don't agree with, but it has seemed to be kind of a truth for me.
It's interesting about the whether you do the framework first or how much you kind of wing it in terms of where the story is going. I mean, I've written 4 novels that have been published, and each of them was different in those terms. I think the first one, I really had no idea where it was going. I had a kind of vague ending in mind. I had 4 characters, and that was about it, and an atmosphere. And I wrote like 3 months of first draft before I wrote a single sentence that ended up in the final book. So I kind of really waded into that very slowly. But the last one I wrote of those 4 was a historical novel, and it was totally the opposite extreme, where I planned out every scene in advance, because it had to fit the actual story, and it had to have a sort of symmetry to it that would work.
Sure.
So I mean, I've kind of done all the ways in between those 4 those extremes, I think. Do you feel? You were saying that you kind of locked into it. Does that mean you've done more or less the same approach with? I mean, I know you've written at least 4 novels, so.
Yes, when I say locked in, that's an overstatement. Obviously, you can step outside that if you need to, but it is kind of there is a natural tendency. It's just a positive reinforcement. I tried it this way, it worked out good, therefore I obviously have the formula now. Clearly, that's not really actually true. But don't you find that some of the best writing in fiction that you do is more a matter of waiting to see what your characters are going to say and do, almost, than it is to put the words in their mouth and frog march them through the process.
I certainly think that's true with individual scenes, and it's true with dialogue. But certainly the further I went on, the more I felt. My last 2 books had better first drafts than the first 2 books, and I think that's partly because I'd kind of organised the structure of the story more in advance, and I was spending less time writing scenes that were not going anywhere, or that were taking a wrong direction and leading me down a path that I didn't want to go.
This must be what they call the craft.
I don't know. I mean, it's just. I think either approach can work.
Can work.
But I certainly agree with what you're saying in terms of within each scene. I never planned ahead what each character was going to say. Or I mean, I don't see how you can do that anyway. I mean.
True, and it's more fun that way, isn't it? Don't you find
absolutely,
it so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's hot work and cold work. I think it's like the hot work is generally more fun.
True. The hot work is less work. Work fits the cold work better. It seems more accurate to call it work than it does the hot work. It's just the inspirational phase of it. I've always admired people who can seem to turn that on and off when they need to. I've never had that skill.
But okay, so literally, what I wanted to ask before was how it fit into your daily routine. Then, I mean, when did you write?
after work.
But would you sit down every evening and try to write? Would you wait for inspiration to come?
Pretty much, pretty much every evening I would sit down. Again, of course, everything I know I learned from Hemingway. He said, always stop for the day when you know what
Before
you're going
the well is run dry.
when you know what you're going to write next, and that does actually work to give you a little bit of a start the next day. And so some of the time that worked for me. Sometimes I would sit down and I would look at the screen, I'd look at the keyboard, and I'd say, I don't have a damn idea in my head. I have no idea what I need to write now. So then I would go watch TV. That's another of my sources of inspiration. And then you know, sometimes it would light up. Something would come to me. Fortunately, it's only a few steps over to the word processor, and I can put something down. But actually, it was more common for me during the day, between appointments, let's say, or at lunchtime, to be jotting things down that I had thought of that I wanted to use, wanted to put into it, and then, you know, just plugging it in and working from there and using that as a starting point. I don't know, you know, you mentioned writing as a, you know, your trade and your daily occupation. I think that probably calls for more discipline about writing than I've ever had. I don't know. Do you?
I think Hemingway also said that you should always sit down and write, even if all you produce is, you know, one paragraph or 5 words, or it doesn't matter. You've got to sit down and try to write. And I think, yeah, because it was more or less the only job I was doing, that's what I did. I mean, I found ways, kind of shortcuts to access that sort of subconscious part. I never watched TV. It was mostly to do with going running or swimming or any kind of physical activity that kind of just freed up my mind, where you're not thinking consciously, where
you're just changing gears, is what you're feeling.
I guess I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of just getting rid of the critical voice, you know.
That's probably an excellent way of looking at it.
Meditation to some extent, you know, if you just kind of lying on bed and just letting it drift over you, and anything that kind of lets it bubble up on its own without you thinking about what's happening to it.
Yeah, once you get into that mode of thinking too much about it, overthinking it, being overcritical, you have then become your own worst enemy as a writer, I think. And again, though, people vary in their ability to switch that off when they need to. Sometimes I've had a hard time turning that off. Getting overcritical is just almost, it's almost, to me, it seems like a hazard that goes with the occupation. But again, I don't know that I want to really say that in that way if it implies that I'm somebody who has spent a career writing, because I have not. I feel like I'm still in a learning phase. I'm still in the phase of trying to learn how to do this, because I did not spend that time. And somehow, I guess, when I'm not at work, when I'm not at the office, no matter how many hours I spent writing that night, my little register up here doesn't count that as so many hours of work. It's I don't always feel that I have put in, let's say, 4 hours of work after work. Probably because of just having spent all those years where that was my job and that was my only job. I went and I did it. I came home and I was done for the day. So your perspective from being a writer, that's what you are. You're a writer. You write. That's your trade. And I've always thought it would be beautiful to be able to do that, or be an artist, be a painter and nothing else, a sculptor and nothing else. I always thought Pablo Picasso, you know, I always thought, boy, he nailed it. He really did, for a life. And yet I've never been able to be in that zone.
Well, I'm no longer in that zone. I mean, I was a writer full-time for about a decade. I'm now full-time translator.
Oh.
I haven't written any fiction in the last 18 months, and that's mostly to do with lack of time. I mean, basically, I couldn't make a living anymore from writing fiction, just writing fiction. And I needed to be able to earn more money every month, and writing fiction is not very good for earning money every month. So I became a translator. I've translated novels as well, and there's a creative element to that. But I certainly do miss the freedom of writing. And I think one of the things I was going to mention is that you get on a roll with writing, where, you know, if you're doing it every day and your mind is functioning that way every day, you're kind of accessing that subconscious part of your mind much more easily than if you stop doing it for a while. And I really want to write now, and I find the idea so much more complicated than I used to, just because my mind has stopped kind of functioning in that way. And I feel like I've got to find another way to get down there again. It seems like a long way from. It's like being suddenly miles from the shore, whereas before I was kind of living on the beach all the time. You know.
Right. It's a good way of putting it. But you know, your mind is kind of like a gigantic warehouse. You know, 4 stories high, a mile long, and it's dark, and you're in there with a flashlight. What you can think about is what comes into the beam of that flashlight. You can point it anywhere you like, but you can't point it everywhere, and that's how our minds work. We just have to point the flashlight somewhere. And one way that I've in giving these workshops, people always look skeptical when I say that, and I can kind of now recognize that expression. So sometimes I will do something like I'll twiddle a pencil, or I'll snap my fingers a few times. Everybody watch this. Watch this. And they watch it for a few seconds, and that's okay, back to me now. I want you to tell me, where was your Social Security number while you were watching me snap my fingers? Where was your date of birth? Where was the name of the first dog you ever had? And go on and name things like that until I could convince them that, oh yeah, there's a lot in there that I'm not looking at any given moment. And some of it is farther down and around more corners than some of the rest of it may be. And I think that's where the deeply unconscious things are. Except that the difference is, with human beings, even the very deep stuff, even the stuff that we're never going to bring fully into consciousness, affects us. It affects what we say, what we do, what we create, and what we fail to create, what we block ourselves with and defeat ourselves with. That's one of the worst things that I see in working as a therapist is people just simply defeat themselves again and again and again. They do it in a repetitive way, and they can't recognize that. So there's a huge portion of any counselor's work in trying to help them see that there is that pattern and overcome it to the extent that they can. But as a translator, isn't that, you mentioned it being somewhat creative. I think it would be more than somewhat, isn't it? I myself am not fluent enough in any other language to probably even imagine what translating a novel would be like. But do you find it, I mean, isn't it about as demanding in terms of creativity as writing a novel is?
No, it's more like rewriting a novel.
There you go.
Because the rails are already there for you. It's all set out. You're not going to vary that much about where it's going. So, but it's still enjoyable. It's enjoyable because it's like the pleasure of reading and the pleasure of writing together. So, and it requires less courage and less whatever it is you need to write afresh every morning, because that's the hardest thing. Even if it's the most enjoyable, I think it's the hardest thing.
You can see where it would be too, because obviously there are no two languages that you can just substitute. Okay, here's the word, look in your dictionary, what's the word in the other language? Sometimes you have to go quite a ways out from a point in the text, I would imagine, in order to rearrange things so that you can say that word, translate that word in the way that it was meant to be read and understood, so that you're not trying to do that approach of just simply word for word for word, you know. And again, this is an admirable skill, something that I have no idea what it would feel like to be able to do. But congratulations on that. But I hope you can get back to writing.
Me too. All right, Tom, that's all I have time for, but it was great to talk to you.
Enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks.